Hey everybody, it's Brian Burns and welcome to this episode of the B2B Revenue Leadership Podcast. Today I got Chris Orlob from Gong joining us, and we're going to be talking about how do you get your reps to understand the competitive landscape of selling in today's marketplace. There's so many products out there, so many alternatives, so much noise that our reps really need to understand how do you position yourself against your competition. And what is that one strategy that is really going to work? And I write about this in my book, and I'd be happy to send my book to anybody who writes a review. Just write a review on iTunes, send me a picture of it on LinkedIn, post it on LinkedIn, and just send me an in-message. I'll send you my book, The Maverick Selling Method. And I talk about this competition thing because I've always sold in hyper-competitive markets, and that's really what we're in today, especially when you're selling a new product or you don't have a huge brand name behind you where they already understand you and how you're different. We're going to be talking about how to position your product, and Chris has done a lot of great work, so make sure you're checking out his blog at gong.io. And they're moving from the stage of being perceived as a nice-to-have to a must-have, because what does every sales manager want? They want the insight into how well the sales conversations are going, how well each of them are without interrupting the rep, without hanging over their shoulder, without listening in and interfering with the sales call. We have to allow reps to do their job, but also help them get better at their jobs because they really do. And they want unbiased, constructive feedback about their calls. And Gong is really the way to do it. But let's get into the episode. I love talking to Chris. He's really done a lot of research here, and it's science-based, and that's what the great part of it is. So you can go check out the blog and get a demo of it, and they've got these cool little GIFs in the demos right now where you can see some of the capabilities of Gong and what you can really get. Instead of sitting in front of a dashboard all day, counting calls and call time and email sent, those are all activity things, and we got to do them. I agree completely. But what really matters is the quality of those conversations when we get there, because we put so much effort into getting them that if we don't execute well and develop our reps, it's just a waste of time. So let's get into the conversation. I'll sum it up at the end and give you an update on the courses. Here we go with Chris. Hey, Chris, welcome back to the show. You had a great blog post on competitive differentiators. What motivated you to write this?
Well, I think it's just because I'm a competitive guy. No, but really glad to be back on the show. It's been a really long time. And I think what motivated me to write this was the insight it brings, because so many companies are getting competitive differentiation wrong, particularly in the B2B space. And I wanted to bring an insight that would help set the record straight with at least a good chunk of your audience, I would imagine.
Yeah, because I think you guys did a great job about how do you lead to the competition. Instead of managers just counting phone calls, dials, call time, and counting emails, I think getting into the actual content of the call, the actual discussion, the questions and answers. Now, let's get into how did you come up with how do you lead to your competition and what's the value of that?
Well, see, I think the biggest way people are doing competitive differentiation wrong, not just in sales, but in B2B in general, is they equate competitive differentiation to the product, right? They think the product needs to be unique, and they think the product is going to save the day if their product is unique. But what is happening today, and this is particularly true, again, in the B2B world, especially like B2B technology, where it's hyper-competitive, is if you rely on your product to differentiate yourself from the competition, you are going to remain highly vulnerable. Instead, what I would argue is the real battleground for differentiating yourself and separating yourself from your competitors has more to do with sales conversations than it does with the product, because what your sellers say, do, and write during the sales process is where the perception of difference is created. And the reason I can make this claim with any credibility is if you look at the progression of any B2B category over the last 5 years or even 10 years, just about every single one has absolutely exploded with competitive choices.
Yeah.
So MarTech is my favorite example. I'm a product marketer, so I kind of, helicopter hat nerd out on MarTech a lot. Back in 2011, I think the date was, there were 150 MarTech vendors. And that already sounds like quite a bit to kind of wade through to figure out what fits your needs best and understand the differences between all of them. But today it's almost 7,000 MarTech vendors. So you'd think 150 is already a lot, but 7 years later in 2018, there are 7,000 of those vendors. So that space has absolutely exploded in competition. And it's one of the worst ones. It's the best example of what I'm talking about. But that is happening in every space. And to bring that point home, that is why this explosion in competition is why you cannot rely on your product to differentiate, because very few products, unique as they may be, are going to have the power on their own to cut through that clutter and rise to the top of whatever competitive landscape you're dealing with. And so I would argue it comes down to sales conversations, to some extent marketing, but honestly, marketing has a very similar problem where we have all this noise, thousands of marketing messages, content is just proliferating, and people are starting to tune it out.
Well, that's it. We've gotten to this point where we've hit peak content. We certainly have hit that over the last couple years, and the content strategy, having great content is good, but everyone's got good content. And last year, I think we hit peak email. The automation of email, the visibility of everybody's email address has kind of saturated the market on email pitches and email marketing, and its effectiveness is being reduced. And I also think that people are moving away from just going to websites and searching and more onto social and trying to find people to solve their problem.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to differentiate with the vehicle of sales conversations, is leading to your differentiators rather than leading with your differentiators. Because again, leading with your differentiators is product focused. So it's, we know what separates our product from competitor A, B, and C at the feature level, and we relay that information back to our customers. But the problem with that is we are assuming our customers value those differences to begin with. And we might get lucky, but really, like, luck is not a strategy, and we're throwing spaghetti at the wall hoping that's working. And so I would argue a better approach is to lead to your differentiators, which means you start with something different. You start with educating your customer about a problem that your differentiator can solve. And once you've framed the conversation in this way and created a sense of urgency and pain, and now you introduce your differentiator, suddenly it's valued by your customer and it sticks.
Yeah, that's it. Because I spent my whole career selling new products into a new market space, much like you guys are today. And you would get all the slides. You get all this information about your product, what it does, how great it is, how different it is than the other alternatives. But all the customer really cares about is the problem that they have and that you solve. If you're not focused on that problem, they don't care about your product.
And a big part of the problem you just described, honestly, I think comes back to my kind, which is product marketers. Especially in multi-product companies, product marketers often have revenue accountability or some sort of P&L accountability. And if they own a product and they have this pressure to generate revenue, especially if they've never sold in their career and they don't know what it's like on the front lines, they tend to schedule a bunch of sales trainings, and those sales trainings are stuffed with product information. They think to get their product into customers' hands, they need to quote unquote, equip their sales team with as much product information as they can, and they just let her rip. But again, what we've seen is if your salespeople are simply relaying product information back to customers, even if it's a unique product, customers are looking at other products too. They can't immediately tell the differences between competitive products, even if you explain those differences very crisply.
Yeah.
Kind of like having twins. You understand the differences between your competitors like the back of your hand because you live in your product and you probably spend a lot of time on your competitors' websites. But if you're relaying information back to your customer about how your product is different and it's the first time they've been exposed to that and you're expecting it to stick, It's kind of like expecting them to tell the difference between two twin children. Again, you as the parent, you're immersed in it. You can tell the differences very easily. It's not so easy for your buyers.
And it is our responsibility to really define the differences, because the market is naturally looking for sameness. They want to position every company as equal, every product as a commodity, because that gives them the power.
Yeah, and I would argue what you said carries some severe implications in crafting your differentiation story. Because if people don't want a product, they want to solve a problem or exploit an opportunity, that means your differentiation story has to be tailored for each of the predictable problems or opportunities that you help customers solve for. So it's like if your product, if your solution, rather, your set of solutions can solve 4 to 5 common problems, most likely what is going to be unique about your solution is going to be different for each one of those problems that you solve. And so that kind of gets rid of this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all differentiation silver bullet that you can, spit across the table to a customer and just have it land.
And in your post, you talk about a very touchy topic about answering the question, who do you compete against? Now, this I've really kind of mastered, because what I always do is flip it back to the person and say, well, it depends on what problem you want to solve, depends on who we typically run up against. Now, what exactly would you like to solve? And I can point you in the direction of the other alternatives. Of course, I point them against the weakest alternatives, because I don't want them, I want them to muddy, I want the water muddied so that I don't have my strongest competitor in that deal.
Well, first of all, I love what you just said. So for anybody listening, I would recommend for them to try that. I have personally not tried it, but just based on what I've seen in my own experiences, I think it would work. The second thing is, you have to win competitive deals early, like you said, but you have to do that before you even know if the deal is competitive. And that way, once it does become competitive, you've already set the landmine, so to speak, for you to win the deal. So here's an example. Let's say you get on a first sales meeting with a prospect and they ask that question, who do you compete with? They're probably not asking that question out of the gate in that sales meeting. They're probably asking that question toward the end of the sales meeting, after you've either given a presentation or demoed your product. So what that means is you have this opportunity for the first 40 minutes or 30 minutes or even 20 minutes of your sales meeting to preempt any competitors that could come up. And the way to do that is by educating your customer about a problem or unexploited opportunity that you can only uniquely solve. Again, going back to what we talked earlier, leading to your differentiators, not with them. And if you've played your cards right, and then you land with your, what's unique at the end of the sales meeting, and they say, well, who do you compete with? You can rattle off all of your most fierce, direct competitors, but you've already set the stage of the sales process, or the buying process, I should say, to be able to win against them.
That's it. And as you get into a competitive situation, or before you do, you have to set the traps for your competitors, so they step right into their weaknesses, or that your customer asks them about their weaknesses and they step right into it. And you have to set a lockout. The one thing that you do, the magic secret sauce of your product that is going to lock out any other alternative. Now, people have a hard time with this because they pick too many lockouts, or they don't know how to set a trap, and they get stuck looking like a commodity, looking like all the same.
Yeah, the lockout. I think the lockout, what you just said, is probably what I was trying to get at there.
Okay. Yeah, a good example of it is that I heard your CEO admit on another podcast, and the host had misunderstood what you did and was bringing up general names of companies that are in the call recording space but don't do AI analysis and reporting on the content of the call. They do more call routing, automating, and things like that.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
It was hard to watch. Yeah, it was hard to watch.
And I'm not sure how familiar he was with those companies, but you guys didn't do anything close to them, and they didn't do anything close to you, to markets.
No. Yeah, he definitely, I mean, they were adjacent technologies to his credit. But I'm very familiar with every company he rattled off in that podcast, but they were not direct competitors at all. So, yeah.
And let's talk about the power of the lockout. How do you apply it? What do you recommend? And you kind of sum it up at the end of the post with the one thing.
You'll have to remind me what I was talking about. I've written a few posts since then.
Yeah, well, Amit, it was his case study when he was at his previous company, took out his competitor for a beer and asked him, how did you win that deal? And that is a classic complex sales strategy, is that you just pound on one thing because people can't remember the five things.
Yeah, so the story there is Amit Bendov, the CEO of Gong. He started his career in enterprise sales, selling very complex software to big companies. And he was fighting to the nail to win a very competitive deal that he had been working on for, I don't even know, I think it was like between 6 and 9 months or 12 months or some sort of crazy timeline like that. It was very competitive. And he ended up losing. And the rep he lost to just happened to be located within a stone throw from Amit as far as like living locations went. And so Amit asked him to a beer because they didn't, for some reason, they didn't ever expect to be competitive with each other again. I think maybe one of them was leaving their companies or something like that. And so he agreed to go out to this beer to help Amit understand why he won the deal. And what the competitor said was every time the discussion would gravitate back toward competition and how we're different and that kind of stuff, he would cling to a single differentiator, and he never rattled off more than one. He would bring the conversation back to that one focal point, back to the one hot button differentiator that he knew he could win with, and he never talked about anything else. And what Amit realized he did, and he has not made this mistake since, is he thought talking about more differentiators would build more value in the customer's eyes. But the problem is differentiating is a little bit like pouring a glass of whiskey. I think I even wrote about this in the blog post.
Yeah.
I shouldn't talk about whiskey as much as I do.
You might have an issue. Yeah.
The analogy there is, if you pour a glass of scotch and you put maybe a couple drops of water in it, you've got a very good evening on your hands. But if you flood it with too much water, now it's not even drinkable, it's not enjoyable at all. And messaging and competitive differentiation works the same way. The less you say, the more it packs a punch. When you're rattling off all of your differentiators, the customer remembers nothing. Nothing sticks.
Yeah.
But continually reinforce one of them as long as it's valuable, and you just keep wedging that into the buyer's mind, now you've got something formidable for your competitors to go up against.
Well, that's it. I love that strategy of the one thing. Early in my career, I worked at this company. We had this capability called Incremental Compilation, where you could make this change to this huge program, and instead of having to recompile or reprocess the whole application, it would just take that change, that tiny little piece. And that enabled us to compete against huge competitors and just crush them and win pretty much every significant deal that we went after.
Yeah, the more I've progressed in my sales and marketing career, the more I've learned, the less you show on like a product demo, for instance, usually the more it resonates. And that can be incredibly hard because you have so many things you want to dog and pony show off. But I was giving a demo to a big company a couple of weeks ago, and I probably walked them through 10% of our platform, and their minds were blown, and I just stopped there.
Yeah. Because they're only going to remember so much. You only have so much time, and they only care about certain things.
Yep.
I mean, when you're looking at a car, it might be the speed, it might be how you feel in the seat, it might be the stereo or the top that comes off. But you play around that, and you really build off of it.
So the most common competitive approach is to attack a competitor weakness, right?
Yeah.
The problem with that is, number one, they're going to refute it. So now you're in this like argument game where the buyer starts to lose trust in both of you because they don't know who's telling the truth. Or just as bad, they're going to correct their weakness. It might be sooner, it might be later, but if you keep calling attention, if you keep using a weakness against a competitor, they're eventually going to fix it so that you can't use that card anymore. And so what is much more powerful is using what I call competitive judo. It is using not a weakness, but a strength against them.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
McDonald's and Burger King back in the 80s, perfect example. McDonald's was the number one burger place by far, and their positioning their strength rather tended to gravitate toward kids. It was a fun place to go. Parents would bring their kids there to have fun, and the entire positioning strategy was built around that, with Ronald McDonald and the play place and Happy Meals and all that kind of stuff. And so instead of Burger King analyzing McDonald's weaknesses and trying to play to those, they took that strength and they used it against McDonald's. And they said McDonald's is to an effect. They said McDonald's is great for kids. Burger King is the place for an adult burger. And what's McDonald's going to say to that? Their entire positioning strategy is built around kids and fun and that kind of stuff. And so now, not just adults, but anybody who wants to be adult-like, which I have a 4-year-old. Trust me, many 4-year-olds want to be perceived as adult-like. Now they gravitate toward Burger King because it's the place for grown-ups to have a burger. And that is a much more powerful differentiation strategy because your competitors are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
And there's a lot of cases of that. There's like Hertz and Avis, where Hertz was number one. Avis admitted, hey, we're number two, but we try harder. And I had that case my whole career where I didn't really work with a sizable company. I was always at startups, and I always competed against much larger companies. We had much more resources and power and context within the account. But I would always say, we're going to be able to support you better. We're going to be able to include the features that you want faster. Those companies are too big, too laggards. They cannot respond at the rate that we can. And that's why we're a better match for what you want to do and the problem that you want to solve.
Beautiful.
Because you know what they were doing. They're like, oh, that company's going out of business. They'll get acquired. That's lost money.
Of course. Yeah. It's such a more fun competitive strategy too, because instead of getting in like this argument competitive battle where each competitor is throwing around FUD, and you're like deteriorating your trust with the customer because all you're doing is mudslinging against each other. Now you're having a much more intelligent conversation because you're kind of eliminating the possibility of an argument from happening between you and your competitor. It's like, hey, we acknowledge that McDonald's is the best place for kids. And if you want to go have fun and, be a kid, that's where you should go. But if you want an adult burger, this is where you want to come get lunch today.
And you pointed out the column fodder thing, where customers or prospects are putting together a matrix of capabilities. And this is always frustrating as a salesperson, especially when you're representing a company that puts millions of dollars and years of development into a capability and it turns into a yes or no instead of, well, it's very different. It's much more complex than that. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more involved in it. It's not just equal or a commodity element, that there's really a capability there that goes beyond you either have it or you don't have it.
Yeah, if you see that happening, you probably did something wrong earlier in the sales process. And frankly, that's the narrative. That goes back to the original point we opened with, which is if you lead with your product, if you're relying on your product to differentiate, that's the story that tends to happen. The customer is going to see a dazzling product demo from you and your competitor and maybe even another competitor. And they eventually get to the point where they want to start to understand the differences between all of these three competitive products. So they create this dreaded spreadsheet with the columns as, the products and the rows as features. And now you get into this horrible spec war where you one up the competitors on feature A, they match you, and one up you on feature B. And that entire cycle continues until the customer, kind of overwhelmed, basically concludes these products are mostly at parity. Some have some features one doesn't, and vice versa. So I'm just going to do the rational thing and start grinding them all down on price. And the winner in this scenario is the company who's most willing to erode the integrity of their pricing model, the one who drops their pants, so to speak.
Yeah, you just know the deal is going to go sideways once you have that discussion. Now, as sales leaders, I would think teaching this stuff is pretty easy, but the hard part would be having them really execute it effectively. What do you think?
See, I would say there's kind of a missing piece in the sales world, which is, and I'll just focus it on competitive differentiation since that's what we're talking about. But if you are blind to sales conversations, it's a little bit like you being a commander in a battlefield and not knowing what's going on. So like you said, you can train your reps on like competitive differentiation, and you should do that. But if you don't know what's actually going on in the front lines where bullets are whizzing past people's heads, you can't really make an intelligent decision as to how you're going to continue to win more competitive deals. Are your reps responding to the "how are you different from competitor A" question effectively? How are your reps preempting competitors? What landmines are they laying down, and how are they responding to competitors' landmines? If you as a sales manager or a VP of sales or just a leadership team don't have any clarity into what's going on in the front lines, it's hope is your strategy.
Yeah. So sales leaders are getting stuck today, I think, with the dashboard that focuses on activity, the quantity of sales activity, not the quality. And I think you guys are really cracking open the opportunity for leaders to get the insights of exactly how well those conversations are going and what is the likelihood of that deal closing and how could they improve the next call.
Yeah. Yeah. To your credit, a sales meeting by itself or a sales call can be 45 minutes, 60 minutes long. And so listening to all of those is not feasible. But if you could instantly see where competitors were discussed within those and listen to those 1-minute sound bites and course correct the trajectory of the deal from there, now you have a competitive command center that gives you a lot more power in winning competitive deals.
Hey, Chris, this is another great conversation. So where do people go to get the blog and also get a demo of Gong and see how it would fit into their company?
So if you want to see a demo, go to gong.io/demo. We'll teach you how you can win more competitive deals by transforming how you sell, not leading with what you sell. So gong.io/demo, DEMO. And if you're interested in reading some of my musings on winning against competitors or sales conversations or the Gong Labs research series, you can find all of that on our blog, which is gong.io/blog, gong.io/blog.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that discussion. I love competitive selling. All the products that I've ever sold were highly competitive in both starting a market space and once the market space develops, getting in and fighting against those 3 to 5 known alternatives and how do you position yourself against them and define the rules for which the company is going to purchase the product, which reminds me, I got a free ebook on how companies buy products. It's at b2brevenue.com. All you have to do is register. I send the book to you automatically. Also, make sure you go to gong.io. Check out the research that they've done there. Even if you're not in market for the product, the research and the blog and the resources are probably the best out there today. They really put a great amount of effort into it. It's not the listicles that you get at most websites. And ask for a demo. Take a look at it. See if it would really improve your sales team, because this is the thing I'd really like to see shift going into 2019 is if sales leaders could focus on the quality of those conversations, the skill sets of the sales reps. Because what we're finding is the number of emails and following in love with the dashboard is taking away from the sales profession, not adding to it. Yes, they have to do work. We get that, and they're willing to do the work. But what I'm hearing is that they're doing more of what doesn't work instead of what does work. And that's really what my courses are all about, is taking a step back and let's take a look at how we approach people and how we start conversations and get meetings. And it's really about people. The old pitch used to work. It did. I used it for years. But today, people have been pitched to death. There's too much noise. We have to take a step back and sell the way people want to buy. They want to deal with people. They don't want to be pushed. They don't want to be rushed, but they do want to solve a problem. So let's focus on that. Talk about what they care about, not what we do. So get a demo at gong.io. I'm telling you, it is now a must-have. If you don't have this, how are you going to scale your sales team? How are you going to tell how good anybody is? Because I'm telling you, they're gaming that dashboard. As soon as they know what you're focused on, they're going to do it. So make sure you're focusing them on the things that really matter. Hey, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.